So families across South Africa face an uncertain future as a growing number of people are losing their jobs. So as we grapple with this, the backdrop is a continuing theme of corruption. Enrolling blackouts, water shortages, a shaky healthcare system and myriad other state failures. Others say this is the cost of corruption and negligent leadership. We speak now to research professor at the University of Johannesburg, Friedman, who argues that corruption in South Africa is deeply rooted in the country's past and that this matters. A very good evening to you, Prof. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We really appreciate it. So please just elaborate first on why you say corruption is one of the country's oldest tradition.
Yeah, thanks to Piso. The first corrupt person to hold an office in South Africa was a guy called Jan van Riebeeck, who arrived here in 1652 because the Dutch East India Company gave him a second chance after he'd been found misbehaving in what is today Vietnam. Within a few years, the Dutch administration in the Cape was getting a reputation for corruption. They were then replaced by the British, who got a reputation for corruption. And so we go. If you to go to the turn of the last century, not this century, you had the war between the British Empire and the local Afrikaans-speaking Transvaal Republic. On the one side was Cecil Rhodes, who had to resign as Prime Minister because he'd given a contract to a friend. On the other hand was Paul Kruger, whose entire government consisted of giving contracts to friends. So this has been going on since the beginning of South Africa. I think what is relevant for now, very important, and I'm not the first person to point this out, is that if you look at the last few years of apartheid in particular, when the apartheid government was fighting sanctions, what you see there is wholesale corruption in government. And then what happens after 1994 is that some people who were previously in the liberation movements get sucked into the same corrupt network, so the people who were fighting each other before 1994 land up in the same corrupt networks. I mean, just to give you one example, obviously this is before courts at the moment, but Thales, the French company who's on trial with former President Zuma, is named as a prime sanctions buster. Thales used to break the rules in order to serve the apartheid government. Now it's accused of breaking the rules in order to serve a post.
And I want to raise something that you've also raised, Prof. That period leading up to democracy, you said there was a blurring of the lines between public and private, as you mentioned. But I also want to deal with this, and it's been coming up a lot, this prejudice that it's simply because black people can't govern. Is this a red herring? As you've mentioned, corruption goes back thousands and thousands of years. It's actually a global phenomenon which goes back thousands and thousands of even more years.
No, it's absolutely a red herring, Tsepiso. As you say, I mean, I've traced the South African history of corruption. A lot of the things, generally that government gets blamed for after 1994, quite rightly in many cases, are things which happened before 1994. And corruption is one example of that. If you look around the world, there was a stage in which virtually the entire American Congress and virtually the entire British Parliament were accused of corruption on one sort or another. So this idea that it's got anything to do with black people running the country is quite frankly simply bigotry. It's simply a prejudice. I think the other thing which I mention in the article, which is something I've written about quite a bit and I think is very important, is that you've also got to see corruption in this country post-1994 in the context of the fact that it's just very difficult very often for black people to get to the top of business. And because of that, people tend to resort to corruption in order to enrich themselves because they can't get in through the normal way. I do want to stress that none of this means that corruption is okay. None of it means that we should simply condone it. But as you correctly point out, we totally miss the point when we say, it's because black people don't know how to govern, majority rule doesn't work. I think it's quite distressing, actually, that in South Africa, you hear this very often from quite conservative white people, but quite frankly, you sometimes hear it from black people. people, oh no, we folks don't know how to govern each other. It's simply not true. There are other factors.
I mean, for us it's important to diagnose the problem if we're going to come up with a cure. So let's then deal with, I mean, you've mentioned just how far back it goes, the complex system that it involves. But what are the real drivers here? What really drives corruption? Because there must be a so-called supply and demand of corrupt acts. Is it the authorizations, the regulations, the characteristics of some taxations, for instance? What drives it?
Well, I think the best way of putting it is this. You know, we have these debates in South Africa, depending on which side of you are, in which some people say, oh, corruption is just a government thing, business is clean. And then somebody else says, oh, well, business is corrupt and government is clean. Well, neither is true. Because really corruption is a particular relationship between sections of business and sections of government. So on the one hand, you have a situation where precisely because, as I said, this is so old and was so much a part of the last few years of apartheid, in which certain businesses are used to buying influence. So they buy influence. On the other hand, you have a situation in which people on the other side of the fence are trying to get in on the game. You know, when white English speakers controlled government in this country, white English speakers controlled the economy. When Afrikaans speakers controlled the government, then they made sure that Afrikaans speakers increasingly controlled the economy. So there is an expectation from some people in politics that now black people should run the government, the economy in the same way. And obviously they want to be among the people who are doing it. And the result of that is that you land up with these networks. You have networks of corrupt people. And if we're going to start dealing with corruption, we have to get rid of this myth that if you get rid of one president and you replace them with another president, that gets rid of corruption.
And that's a very important question, because I wanted to look at how the Northern Hemisphere, for instance, is dealing with corruption. There's been a concern around growing of corruption. And in some cases, you can see that the language is different to address certain things. So can you really get rid of corruption if you can't, or if you don't reform the state?
Well, no, you can't. But I mean, there are short-term remedies and there are longer-term remedies. And part of the reason corruption is becoming so prevalent in the entire world today is, you know, that the kind of controls that the state imposed on economic activity have weakened dramatically. And that's true of just about every country on the planet. In our country, we really have to worry very much about the fact that it's so difficult for people to get into the economy, because we're not going to change things dramatically until that happens. But you can't wait for that to happen. I understand that. And I think what we ought to concentrate on now is identifying the networks and trying to break up the networks. And the good news is that it's been done. You know, a few years ago in the Department of Home Affairs, you may remember it had a tremendous reputation for inefficiency and corruption, and a particular person, it happened to be Mvuso Musimang at that stage, was appointed Director General and turned the department around. And I would imagine that one of the reasons he turned it around was by working out who it was who was working with each other to defraud the citizenry and taking action. So it can be done. It's not easy, but we're just not going to do it by these very simplistic solutions you hear at the moment. You know, we were told that when Mr. Zuma was no longer president, when somebody else was president, we'd solve the problem. Obviously, that wasn't true, and the reason is precisely because it's very deep-rooted.
And finally, Prof, some people have said, I mean, you can say all you want about corruption, it takes time, but most importantly, it's costly. As we've seen with the State Capture Commission, people have bemoaned how long it's taken, but equally, then they're very happy to hear some of these details come out, and the Hawks, for instance, take action.
Look, the other thing I think must be said, you know, it remains a tremendous problem. I simply do not think it is true to say that the current government under the current president has done nothing about this. In fact, an awful lot has been done. It's testimony to how deep the problem is that an awful lot will still have to be done. I think we need to distinguish between the government and the governing party. The governing party has a huge problem it's not dealing with. The government has, over the last 2 years, put in place new leadership in the NPA. It's changed the boards of state-owned enterprises. A lot of people are in danger of losing ill-gotten gains. There are a whole lot of prosecutions at local level. And of course, we've seen over the last few days a whole series of new prosecutions. I have no doubt there will be other prosecutions. And I'm sure that there is a serious attempt to get on top of this problem. I'm simply warning that what is being done at the moment is essential, but unless we understand how deep-rooted the problem is, we're going to sit with it for many years.
Research Professor at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Stephen Friedman, thank you very much for your time and insights. And of course, we've been asking you, what do you believe is the driving force behind corruption? And as you've heard him give us the lowdown, just how far it goes, let's listen to what some of you are saying, voice notes and tweets.